Labdien, Edmund, and good morning, Christopher. And today we have a very special guest, and Christopher will be the one who will introduce Edmund.
Today, we are joined by Edmunds Vanags, a clinical psychologist and researcher at the National Center for Mental Health in Latvia, also affiliated with Riga Technical University, who studies something we all rely on in our industry, but rarely stop to examine: how the human mind actually works. His research spans cognition, emotion, memory, and mental health, as well as how we interact with technology and artificial intelligence. But what makes his work especially relevant for this conversation is how he frames the mind itself, not as a static storage system, but as something constantly moving between past experience, incoming signals, and internal states. So in other words, what we notice, what we remember, and how we act is being shaped in real time. Now, if that's true, then a lot of what we assume about how people think, decide, and remember may need a bit of a rethink, which sits right at the heart of what we're exploring here at brandLingual and with this expert series. I could not think of a better person to have on than you, Edmunds. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good morning.
Okay, then I will ask the first big question. It's about how people actually form memories in their minds. There's an assumption that the human mind works with information in two ways. One is through memories we retrieve from the past, our previous knowledge and experience, and the other is through incoming signals from the external world as well as from our body. In science, there's a view popularized by Lisa Feldman Barrett that the mind works almost like a switch, moving between past experience and present input. Stored knowledge and experience are constantly compared with incoming signals. We wanted to understand whether this assumption is correct. If not, then what would be your explanation?
Well, one should probably say that this is not the only theory that currently exists. There are several on the agenda, but this is one of the dominant theories right now in neuroscience and cognitive sciences. What is currently being postulated is whether our mind really constantly predicts what will happen in the next second, the next moment. And these predictions are linked to our models of experience. For example, I'm now looking somewhere in my room, and I have a prior experiential model that where I direct my gaze, there is some object, and the optical signal entering my eyes, reflected from this object, confirms my prediction, saying, yes, everything is fine. That object really is there, and this happens in milliseconds. On the other hand, if someone had taken that object and placed it somewhere else, and my optical signal in the eyes said, there is no such object there, but the brain's model says that the object should be there, a mismatch arises. In this theory, it functions like surprise. The surprise that my model is not correct. And what the brain does at that moment is an attempt to correct this model so that I reach some kind of balance. But what I wanted to say with this main principle is that our brain constantly predicts what will come and happen in the next moment. And these sensory signals that we receive through the eyes, ears, touch, smell, and taste either confirm our predictions or previously formed models or reject them. Therefore, memories in this process are continuously formed. If I learn something new, most often new memories are formed precisely at the moment when my brain's model has not predicted what is present in my sensory signals. So if I see something new, my brain tries to store it for some time. And then the question is, what happens next? One could say that there's some kind of slider between this past experience and the present, but that would perhaps be very, very simplified. But overall, yes, this is currently the dominant understanding of how the human mind works, and the classical assumption that, as was once thought, these sensory signals enter our head like into a black box, and then we figure out what it is. And only then do we gain an understanding of what we are seeing or hearing at that moment. We no longer think this way because all the evidence shows that the flow of information goes in the opposite direction. We already have a preformed model, and we use sensory signals only to either confirm or correct these models.
Vai nu apstiprināt vai koriģēt šos modeļus.
What about long-term and short-term memory? Because if I'm not mistaken, in your lecture at the University of Latvia's open-minded platform, you said that it's also known in our field that both short-term and long-term memory exist. What determines whether a person stores information in long-term memory rather than keeping it only for a short period, just for a few hours or days?
This is a very good question, because in fact, it has not been fully answered in modern science. We have several assumptions, different levels of explanation that may perhaps help bring some clarity, but not completely. Nowadays, perhaps the term working memory is used more often, and long-term memory as truly long-term memory, which stores units of information over a longer period of time. And why does something remain in long-term memory? There could be several explanations. First of all, now I'm walking down the street, perhaps absorbed in my thoughts, and suddenly I see police. Moments that are very intensely experienced will definitely remain in long-term memory, and in my episodic memory, there will indeed remain an episode. For example, that I am now walking down the street and see police officers chasing someone. This episode will most likely remain in my mind for a long time. On the other hand, if I now sit in some lecture and a monotonous voice presents some new theory, I might doze off a little, and if someone asks me an hour later what the lecturer talked about, I will say I have absolutely no idea. Well, yes, and I will be the one who first raises a hand in the audience and says, "Send me the slides so I can even remember what was going on there." This mechanism that allows us to retain something in the mind is quite peculiar. But perhaps I would invite you to look at it from the perspective of nature. In essence, my brain stores information that could be valuable for me to survive in the future. And we now live in a highly urbanized environment, an industrialized environment, with fairly good and high comfort conditions. And essentially, we do not need to remember that much. I can quite well drift along the streets, surf channels, watch TikTok in the evening, and reliably find the refrigerator at home, contrary to, for example, I don't know, people thousands of years ago who tried to survive, to catch some animal, or to escape from neighboring tribes. They constantly needed this new knowledge to understand where danger is, where safety is. And so, these long-term memories mostly form when life, to some extent, forces me to form them. Either I myself want it, I go to Spanish language classes, study properly, and complete all the tasks and repeat several times. If my brain stores this information, then the first principle that allows information to be placed into long-term memory is the number of repetitions. The more often you repeat, the greater the probability that this information will remain there. In that sense, in all cognitive psychology handbooks, there are often references to the advertising industry, saying, "Learn from the advertising industry," because they are able to achieve that people remember one brand better than the others in the long term. So this number of repetitions, that is some kind of basic principle. Because those vivid events, for example, when the police are chasing someone, or now, I don't know, if I pulled out a weapon and fired into the air. We cannot ensure such vivid episodes all the time. Therefore, some mechanisms must be used to store this information in long-term memory. Vivid episodes, and those things that we repeat many times and consciously learn.
Mācāmies, tās tur paliek.
Kā ir ar uzmanības līmeņiem?
What about levels of attention? Because attention can vary from high to low. There's also this assumption that today, since information is so easily available and we don't rely as strongly on survival instincts as we once did, like in more demanding environments, our attention tends to be lower. So how do these shifts in attention affect memory later on? For example, if we move through life somewhat passively, not paying much attention, with low levels or focus, how does that influence what we are able to remember when it actually becomes necessary?
Vēlāk, pie nepieciešamība.
Between different information channels. These may be interconnected or perhaps completely different. And if we look at what is happening in the student's brain or mind at that moment, we see that attention switches very quickly from one channel to another. If we measure the outcome, for example, later checking how well the student has learned what he was studying at that time, how much he remembers from the song he heard, or what he remembers from that TikTok in that short episode, we will find that in all information channels, he will remember a little, some small proportional amount, but nowhere will the result be good. And that is why these studies in the educational environment relentlessly show that, for example, in high-stakes situations, exams, tests, assessments, if we use certain technologies that only distract us and divert attention, the results suffer. Or, even better examples. Currently, in road traffic accidents worldwide, one of the top 3 main causes is that people use phones while driving. And that is the reason. Yes, because the phone is a powerful distractor. Unfortunately, if I want to drive at 100 kilometers per hour on a highway and not hit anyone or drive into a ditch, I have to concentrate on the road. I cannot put myself on autopilot. But our life right now has conditioned us to do several things at once. So, to answer the question, if we really divide our perception of information across many channels and attention is diluted, and we do not truly devote the necessary attention anywhere, then we can expect that in all things, actions, and activities, there will be insufficient attention. We will not devote enough attention to anything. Therefore, I assume that in the advertising industry, this landscape is also probably changing. How do people notice anything at all in this enormous flow of information? What determines why, seeing so many different brands, I nevertheless focus on one? Yeah, and then, returning again to the principles of memory, the formula would be roughly this. There must be a very strong first experience with that product, and then in repeated encounters with this product, it is enough that it simply appears somewhere, or a part of it appears, and I can easily recall it. Because unfortunately, research shows that people recognize products well when they see them, but remember them poorly when they are simply asked to recall, what is your favorite brand? He's like, well, wait, this one, and you show just some color or fragment, and he immediately recognizes it. Recall differs from recognition. Recognition is much, much easier than recall, because recalling is currently very difficult for people. Studies also show that we no longer remember even elementary things. We do not know the phone numbers of our relatives. We barely remember various important things. Yes, maybe PIN codes or passwords. But even with passwords that we supposedly remember, probably everyone uses password managers. So things are changing. Something is changing in this cognitive landscape. We currently process information somewhat differently than we did 100 or 150 years ago.
Can we say that in low attention conditions, repetition still plays a significant role? For example, in the context of social media, when we scroll and see certain information, maybe from a brand, on a more unconscious level, we keep encountering the same message or visual element repeatedly over a longer period of time. So this would be that combination of repetition and low attention.
Or low attention.
Šis nestrādā. Es domāju, ka šis lielākais
This doesn't work. I think that in most cases it doesn't work. Well, it might work, or most likely it works in isolated experimental conditions, because often science is also conducted in a laboratory in isolated conditions where everything is calm and quiet. Now, 3 or 4 experimental products are shown, and then afterwards, they check which one is best remembered, and then conclude that the one with the higher number of repetitions remain. Yes, but when we compare human abilities with real life, where the flow of information is chaotic, much more dynamic and rapid, then these effects disappear. I think that this is where misconceptions mostly arise, that we refer to science and say, look, it worked in the experiment, but in reality, those field conditions are many times more complex and complicated. So I would say that if you, for example, I could imagine that in a news feed, a person sees some event 7 times, but in between, there are another 70 different events. He will not remember it, even with a large number of repetitions. An initial exposure is necessary. That is needed. You need to hook that attention onto something at the beginning. Not for nothing, as far as I have read, studies have been conducted on TV series. I think that people in the world currently really like watching series. It's also a relatively new film format. Of course, it is not completely new, but compared to the history of cinema, it is a relatively recent genre. And the creators of these series very consciously understand that the pilot episode is everything. Yes, if you don't succeed with that pilot episode, then it is very difficult. Of course, there are exceptions. I don't know. Breaking Bad, which picks up around the 3rd episode. But mostly, these are series that are good and interesting, yet still try to capture viewers with the 1st episode. Often, these are also longer because it is necessary to manage to tell that interesting story. Yes, and since there is strong repetition, yes, it's exactly the same there. They are competing. So it can work better, I think, if there is a strong initial exposure, something memorable, some big event, some unusual twist, or something innovative. And then, with these low-level repetitions, you can maintain that level. But research also shows that one brand, with very rare exceptions, on average cannot remain in people's memory for a long time. There also needs to be some kind of periodic refresh or something similar, rebranding, or something like that. It happens, yes, that a refresh of that advertising content is needed.
Are you familiar with Burrhus Frederick Skinner's approach? As I understand, he was an American behavioral psychologist.
Frederick Skinner, PA.
Yes, well, I am thinking about Skinner from the previous century who worked in the 1940s and 1950s. Yes, Skinner is known as a founder of behavioral psychology who indeed belonged to that stream, because in the science of psychology there have been several paradigms, as is common in science. And then, for a long time, from the 1920s to somewhere in the 1950s, there was this behavioral paradigm. The main idea was that behavior is the most important thing. We can conclude something about a person only if we measure something that is in their behavior. That is, we do not ask what they think, but we look at what they do. From that, we will infer how we can change that behavior, how we can manipulate this behavior to achieve a desired effect. Yes, so he definitely belongs to those who developed this paradigm over a long period with various experiments, and even reached the point of trying to write a formula for human action or to express human behavior with the help of a mathematical equation. And those attempts, of course, came to nothing, because when they began to write this equation, well, I don't know. For example, a person is now walking down the street, sees object X, which enters their perception and changes something in their behavior. Then afterwards, there is some Y, then there's X1, then something else. And the more they became aware of everything that can influence human behavior, the more they realized that in fact the number of conditions is infinite. They are changing over time, and to describe that in a single mathematical form is extremely difficult.
Christopher, maybe you want to ask the question about Skinner.
Yeah. So sometimes in our industry, we talk about Skinnerian reinforcements, where the idea of co-presenting two things next to each other, oftentimes a brand and then something emotionally charged. And the more that we co-present these things together, there's this expression that the memories that fire together, wire together. And that co-presentation over time through repetition allows you to make them more distant. And at one point you just show this thing, it still connects back to this thing over time. And this is something we talk about as a way to operationalize or practice repetitive encoding to encourage some kind of action. From your expertise, is this a viable concept to operate in, or is it an oversimplification given the chaotic world that people are experiencing these things in?
I think that partly it is. A certain regularity should always be remembered. That the Skinnerians, Skinner and his students, experimented with animals, mostly in laboratory conditions. Here, there is also a big myth that we draw conclusions about life based on observations from laboratory experiments. Because what distinguishes a laboratory experiment is that we really put a rat in a cage. We can very precisely control the moment when we switch on a light signal, and then some grains are released. And every time the light flashes, grains are released, and at some point, we only turn on the light, and the rat goes to the place where the grains usually fall. Yes. And in this way we conclude, okay, we can successfully associate two signals, but this does not always work. In real life, where the number of conditions is much greater, we cannot control them well. How precisely and in what dosage can we give the consumer one signal and another so that together they form a connection? Real life or field experiments and studies show that this effect is unstable. It is not long-lasting. It may exist at that moment, it may not. It may be stronger for some people, weaker for others. And for a third person, the connection does not form at all. So this kind of linkage is not very clear. It is not a law that we can use to achieve a desired effect. In psychology, in general, it must be said, there are no laws, unlike in the natural sciences, where we truly use various laws. I don't know, like the law of gravity, or Ohm's law, or relationships of acceleration, or any constants related to that. There's a logical mathematical structure underlying them. With regard to humans or the living world in general, we actually still have not discovered clear laws. That truly, if you do this, then that will happen. There's always a very large variation in human behavior responses, with enormous differences, including very large cultural differences. What works in Indochina does not work in Australia, and maybe partly works in Japan. Yes, so we also mostly base our conclusions about whether behavior can be changed on the so-called weird idea. Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic. That is, westernized populations. And in these studies, we can indeed observe some weak relationships, but when we repeat them in other countries that are not as rich or educated, this effect simply does not work. Therefore, what I want to say is that currently in psychology and cognitive sciences, there are no laws. We do not know clear regularities. We observe many effects, and this reinforcement effect of Skinner is one of them. Yes, it was indeed observed. It still is. Observed more in animals, less in humans. That is indeed the case. But it is not something that we can control well or manipulate reliably. So, if you can place people in some kind of isolated environment, you will probably observe this effect better, but in real life, it may not appear.
Reālajā dzīvē viņš var nebūt.
You had mentioned earlier, too, the amount of emotion that is necessary for someone to store something in lasting memory. And the examples you were giving were very vivid and in some cases maybe even survival-based or violent. For example, you mentioned you see the police chasing someone, or a gun gets shot in the air, or a Breaking Bad episode where often there's a lot of drama. And these are all high levels of emotion, like survival-oriented emotion. Meanwhile, in the marketing world, oftentimes our ability to have any emotion is compromised. So what I'm sensing from you is that it takes quite a bit a very strong emotion to store something in lasting memory as opposed to just something funny. I'm curious to hear you speak about the relative levels of emotion. Sometimes we say, if you feel more, you remember more. And if you remember that brand more, the chance you have to buy it goes up. But the feeling that you have to feel has to be fairly extreme.
That is a very good question. And again, I would like it if we could take some kind of table and look at where these levels are. And then I could tell you, you need this much positive emotion and a little negative emotion. For example, fear. And in combination, the desired result might arise. Unfortunately, in this process, there's a large variation. And if we show the same video clip to 100 people, then 30 will laugh, 20 will shrug their shoulders, 20 will feel sad, and another 20 will walk away, because we will see very different emotional reactions. And this too is one of the myths that come from the history of psychology, that emotions are universal. They are not universal. They are very, very diverse, with a great deal of variation. They differ across cultures. There are, for example, cultures in the world where a smile is considered a sign of fear. Yes, that American smile is very widespread. It has successfully influenced many cultures in the world, but it is not everywhere. And there's also historical evidence suggesting that in the past, people did not smile at all. It is a relatively new emotional expression on our faces, which appeared roughly 300 to 400 years ago. So if emotions are not universal, we understand that this is not a factor we can reliably manipulate in a given experiment or activity. The second thing that probably limits the use of this mechanism is, as you correctly said, that we need fairly extreme values for them to be well remembered. And if we think about how many advertisers will want to use this mechanism, we understand that oversaturation would occur very quickly, and therefore it is not a reliable effect. We cannot manipulate it all the time. I have also told students in lectures, I see, for example, that I'm talking about something, and I notice that half are interested in asking questions, while the other half are sitting on their phones or doing something else. And I say, how I wish I could do something right now so that you would all pay attention. And do something shocking, so that this lecture would remain in your memory for the rest of your life. And that would be true. I could bring a gun to the lecture, fire at the ceiling, a piece would fall down, the police would come and take me out of the auditorium. The students would 100% remember this lecture for the rest of their lives, but hardly anything from the lecture itself. If all lecturers started doing something crazy in every class, even though a course consists of many sessions, at some point it would simply become massive oversaturation. It would stop working. So while it is an interesting mechanism, it cannot be reliably manipulated. And perhaps another, not entirely related, simple example that came to mind. In studies on autobiographical memory, because autobiographical memories are something we remember the longest, who I am, where I come from, who my parents are, yes, I may forget what I studied at university or school, but most likely I will remember my childhood for my entire life, even if only fragmentarily. And then adults were asked, what do you remember most from your childhood? Most adults remember episodes with their parents. They say, yes, the sun was shining. It was warm. There was some smell in the air. We were going somewhere. We went for a walk. And almost no one remembers what they were given, what gifts their parents gave them. And we, as parents, always think the opposite. If we now give something nice to our child for Christmas, they will remember it for the rest of their life. Maybe if it is something really, really special, but they will not remember a tablet. They will not remember a game console. They will not remember clothes. But they will remember those warm moments we spent together. And then my question is, can this closeness between parents and children, which can be spontaneous, we've laughed together, played board games, walked by the sea, searched for seashells, and watched the sunset, can that be constructed? Can it somehow be artificially planned? created, that probably leads again to the idea that it is something spontaneous, something that was so nice in my life that I remember it for the rest of my life. Yes, these extreme emotions can indeed create very strong memories, and possibly for a lifetime. But that is not something you can do regularly. It can be done sometimes, rarely, but not on a continuous basis.
Can I step back a bit and ask a broader question, still within the context of emotions? In your lecture series, you spoke about emotions. So, my question is, what is their actual function in the human body? In the lecture, you mentioned that emotions essentially help us sense what is happening here and now, and through that, we adapt to the next moment. In a way, we could say that we internally reprogram ourselves by shifting our internal state. Is this correct?
Tās pašas
Within that same theoretical framework, the overarching theory is called predictive coding or predictive processing. So, predictive coding. Our mind operates using probabilities, a kind of computational theory. Our mind is constantly trying to calculate, predict, and anticipate. Alongside this is another concept, the free energy principle, defined by Carl Friston, which very clearly states that the energy budget in our body is limited. It is not infinite. We do not live off the sun. We need to eat. We need air. We need water. And we need to do this continuously. We must take in this external energy in order to be able to do anything. So, if we assume that our energy is not infinite and can run out, in adults it usually runs out by the end of the day, and in children even faster, then what can we do to use our energy better? The brain can begin to predict, like an accountant, how much energy do I have left? The less there is, the more I should rest and do fewer things. And every time our brain makes predictions, and there is this internal balance between how much energy I have left and what I still need to do. If a mismatch arises, most likely negative feelings will appear. Irritation, fatigue, grumpiness, unwillingness to act, laziness. And I will do everything to avoid doing additional things so that everyone leaves me alone and I can go to sleep. Conversely, if I have more energy and the internal balance says, hey, you have a positive balance, you can continue working for a long time and achieve your goals. My feelings tell me that everything is fine. My body is functioning right now. I have sufficiently good energy reserves. And with such a budget, I experience positive emotions. Yes, I have a lot of strength, energy, joy, and satisfaction. It feels nice. And if life has turned out well and the future looks bright, but probably each of us has experienced that this state quickly ends. I may feel a kind of light euphoria, thinking, oh yes, great, life is good. But then some news arrives. My wife calls and says, listen, the rear axle of our car broke. Now we have to take it to a repair shop. I immediately do not have spare money, and this hits my balance, and I start to feel worse. So emotions are a signaling mechanism. It could be compared to traffic. There is a traffic light, red light, yellow light, green light. Of course, emotions are not that simple. They are very diverse and varied, but essentially, they are a repertoire of feelings that help us understand what to do now, what not to do, where to move, where it is safe, and what might be less safe. Emotions help regulate our body's behavior and actions, and we simply have the opportunity to use these emotions to adjust our actions. And what is perhaps always on my mind, and may be harder to accept, is that emotions are always about the future, not the past. It may be intuitively difficult to accept, but emotions are always about the future. Why? Because from a biological perspective, nature is not interested in the past at all, since it is something that has already happened, and we can no longer change it. Nature is always interested in the future, and emotions help us orient ourselves, better orient ourselves toward the future. Whether it is the next second, or perhaps 10 seconds, or minutes, that is another question. Emotions are more about these immediate, second-by-second decisions. Mood, on the other hand, is more about hours, days, and longer periods. Yes, but this internal state essentially reflects what we are ready for and what we are not ready for.
Kam mēs esam gatavi un kam nē.
Es papildināšu taču jautājumu. Let me add to that question. Is it possible to stimulate a person to feel positive emotions towards specific things?
Jā, protams.
Of course. If you were to give me some nice thing now and say, well, if you start using this every day, you will feel better, you will have more energy. Yes, there would be two effects. One would be a broad placebo effect, because it would simply work due to the fact that I really want something in my life to change, but that usually has a short-term effect. But if that tool truly has some ability to improve my life or reduce certain negative aspects, my mental model will want to return to this thing again and again. Because in the mind, there will remain a model that this thing, in my case, helps improve something in my life, and everything always comes back to the amount of energy. Because things help me reduce energy expenditure, they help reduce the amount of negative emotions and increase the amount of positive emotions. A very blunt example. Why do people use drugs? Why do people use psychotropic substances? It is a shortcut to a false reduction of energy expenditure. Yes, drug use creates the illusion that everything is fine, that I have a lot of energy in my body. Nothing matters anymore. Nothing concerns me. Yes, but that is not a real reducer of energy, and in the long term, it actually increases energy costs even more. So yes, it is possible, of course, with various methods.
Dažādiem paņēmieniem.
Edmunds, you said something that really stopped me in my tracks. It was emotions are always about the future. And that rewired something in my brain when you said that. The emotion hit me. It's a very simple statement, yet it has, I don't know, very strong implications about how we spend time with each other, how we understand our own feelings, and why we are always ruminating and catastrophizing and worrying and forecasting something next. And so many of our emotions are excited about something next, always next. So I received that as a very strong confirmation, but also it just felt very enlightening or unlocking in a way. So anyway, that to me was a very profound thing that was said that changes a lot of how I've been processing some things. So if anything, I'm emotionally reacting to that statement and thinking about in the future how it might change the way I'm thinking about my own practice. So thank you for that, Paldies.
Ok, priecājos, ka palīdzi.
All right. Well, I'm glad it helps. And yeah, it's not easy for me myself to live with this idea either, because it goes against my intuition, since it seems to me that emotions are about something that has already happened. Yes, I don't know. My son says something perhaps unpleasant to me now, and I feel upset about it. Of course, if you think logically, it is about the past. But in reality, I feel upset because my brain is now predicting that it will continue like this, that our relationship might deteriorate, and that it may become harder for us to communicate. And so, in a way, these emotions and such emotional experiences tell me, hey, something is not right. There will be a lot of energy to spend in the future. Yes. And then the question is, how can I use this emotional state to change the future or to blame the past, which in fact I can no longer change? So this is quite counterintuitive, and it is not always easy to remember and accept. But in some cases it can work. If we are aware of it, and if we use it reasonably, then we can actually improve our models and predictions and spend less energy.
From my side, I think I don't have any more questions. I heard answers to the questions I had on my list. They just came through naturally in your responses. Internally, we have had quite a big discussions with Christopher about whether memories can be built or only refreshed. At one point, we leaned toward the idea that no, memories are actually what shape who we are, and we just assemble them associatively when new elements appear. For example, we had a conversation about a rainbow. I said that when a child sees a rainbow for the first time, they are amazed, and that becomes the first memory they build around that experience. And Christopher said, no, that's not it. It's just colors that you bring together in that moment and define almost as a new object. And from what I understood, you addressed this at the beginning of our conversation, that memories are actually being constructed or formed continuously in every moment.
Jā, mēs vajag, labi, varbūt
All right, maybe not every day, but still there are things we have to remember every day. Memories about model accuracy. Perhaps that is something slightly different as well. These are not conscious memories, but rather neural processes that continuously allow me to improve my predictions. Heinrich Helmholtz comes to mind, a 19th century scientist and psychophysicist, sometimes called the father of the predictive coding theory. Although at that time, of course, the technical capabilities were not sufficient to properly understand what was happening in the neurons and brain of a human. But even then, there were many psychophysics experiments, and these psychophysicists tried to understand sensory limits and capabilities of humans using various clever methods. Helmholtz studied vision extensively, and they quickly realized something important. Even earlier, people understood that it is strange that we have eyes in the front, but the visual cortex that processes visual information is located at the back of the brain. And then the question arises, why? Why such a complex system? Why is the brain structured so complicatedly? Helmholtz had the idea, which he also described in his book, that if it really is the case that light enters the eyes and then is converted and transferred to the back of the brain where we understand it, then physically, this is a very, very slow process, and we would not be able to react to fast events. For example, think of a baseball player. When a ball is thrown at him, he has about 1.7 seconds to decide at what angle to hit it, but he only sees it with some delay. If we look at recordings, baseball players already swing when the ball has just been thrown. He already knows what will happen. Without internal models, that would not be possible. Helmholtz already said in the 19th century, we must have visual models in the mind about how the world is structured. We must imagine before we even see something. And in fact, he formulated this predictive processing theory. He also supported it with a vivid childhood memory. He was walking through a city with his mother, and there was a large church with a tower. In church towers, there used to be open platforms where people rang bells. And he said, "Mom, look, up there in the tower, there are these little people. I think they are dolls. Could you reach up and give me one of those dolls?" And his mother said, "But that is very high up, tens of meters. I cannot reach that far." And at that moment, he could not understand how that could be. Only when they later went up did he say, "Oh, it is so high." And he realized that his naive idea of little dolls that he could simply take, if I can see it, I can take it, was a wrong mental model. He replaced it with the more accurate model that things can be far away, sometimes very far from us. So yes, that is very interesting. The beginning of the theory, so to speak, which leads to today's understanding, now based on many neuroscience experiments where we can actually see how information moves through neurons and cells. And we see neural cells constantly forming new predictions, correcting old ones, and when new information is completely outside prior experience, new memories are formed. And there used to be the assumption that new neurons in the human brain are formed only up to around age 25. Today, we know from solid experimental studies that new neurons are also formed at the age of 90. in elderly people, but with one condition: if they do something completely new and unusual. If they travel to a country they have never been to, new neurons start forming in their brain related to that new environment. The new city, the new place, the store, the waterfall, and so on. Or if a person joins a dance class, learns new movements, learns a musical instrument or a new language. We constantly need to learn in order to keep the brain active and in a healthy, alert state.
tādā mūžā stāvoklī.
Ļoti jauki.
Very interesting. In our podcast, we place the idea of unlearning at the center. The idea that in order to grow as a professional, you spend time learning different things and then at some point realize there are things you need to unlearn. Since you have also had lecture on this topic and I have taken your course on learning techniques and how to learn more effectively and more productively, I would like to ask, why do people resist this unlearning phase? Why is it so difficult for them to let go of what they have learned, to take in something new, or to, in a way, break the identity they have built around their existing knowledge?
Uzbūvēto identitāti.
Okay, šis ir ļoti labs jautājums.
All right, that's a very good question. It directly connects with what we were talking about because everything again comes back to this energy principle. Any formation of new memory will be quite a metabolically expensive process in my organism. Truly, learning new things and consolidating them is a very energy costly process. Our brain makes up about 3% of the whole body, but if we add everything up, and people working in this field have done this, it turns out that the brain consumes the most energy among all body systems: muscles, internal organs, cardiovascular system, and so on. That again sounds completely illogical because I have many muscles in my body, and I know that when I go to the gym and lift weights, it hurts a lot, and I feel very tired. Or if I go on a 20-kilometer hike, I simply cannot walk anymore. The whole body is exhausted. Meanwhile, when our brain gets tired, we don't really feel it directly because there are no pain receptors there. I only experience it through emotions and similar signals. But from an energy perspective, the brain is the most energy-consuming system. It is a huge computer that consumes a lot of energy, and every learning process consumes a lot of energy. That is why as we get older, the question arises more and more. Why should I spend energy on something I may already have? I already have old models. They have worked so far. Why are you now telling me there will be a new model? Maybe it will be slightly better, but I have managed with the old ones. Yes, so there is resistance, because as soon as we start learning new things, the brain says, hey, this is going to be expensive. This is metabolically inefficient. It comes up with all kinds of reasons not to do it, in a metaphorical sense. For children, unlike adults, when they are still developing and growing, their metabolic calculation is reversed. They spend more, do more, grab, try to see, hear, and do everything in order to obtain more information and build a new model of the world. For adults, this is much more difficult. That is why learning techniques and the science of learning also study and try to find mechanisms that could motivate people to acquire new knowledge. There are various methods from science that can be used to sell these new learning ideas. Also, by finding the right timing and place, because often these lifelong learning courses are something extra on top of everything else. After a full work week, now you also have to go to a seminar on Saturday. Smart organizations allocate a lot of time for learning periods. They emphasize to employees that learning is also work. On those days, we will not do anything else. The seminar will not just be theoretical lectures. We will talk a lot, do a lot, and actively use new knowledge, allowing it to be absorbed calmly, consolidated, and tested to see that it actually works better. If this can be packaged, well, it's great. But more often, these learning programs are rushed, fast, and overloaded. There's too much of everything, and then people simply sit through it and in the end learn nothing. So yes, it is difficult, because forcing yourself to learn in adulthood is not easy, unless you really, really like it. If you offer me to learn ukulele or saxophone or a fun new board game, okay, why not? Because it sounds like there would be a lot of positive emotions during learning. New theories, new approaches, new slides. The ability to make the learning process sufficiently valuable and engaging is essential and fundamentally meaningful.
Pēc būtības vērtīgu.
Christopher, maybe you have some questions?
I mean, the idea that the metabolic process of your brain, it's that there's no pain receptor
Yep.
for your brain feeling overworked or tired. And thus, we process in different ways. I assume this leads to depression, other things. Your body is still trying to react to something without a pain receptor. And thus there's a cognitive dissonance there, literally, because when my arm hurts, I can go, oh, it's because I lifted that thing. It seems very linear, very logical. Don't lift that thing, put the arm down. That's why. But I've been thinking and working so hard and I have no pain receptor. I don't quite know where to place the blame, or I don't know why I feel this way, because it's not as clear as saying, my chin hurts or my ears hurt. It's just this general fog or confusion. Does that just contribute to the misunderstanding of how people feel when they can't explain a phantom pain or something like this?
Taisnības labad jāsaka, ka mums tomēr ir galvā.
To be fair, it must be said that we do actually have pain receptors in the head, but they are only in the blood vessels, because of course we can get headaches. For various reasons, the blood vessels constrict. There are pain receptors in blood vessels, but neurons themselves do not have pain receptors. You may remember The Silence of the Lambs with Anthony Hopkins, the film about the cannibal Lecter. There was a scene where he was cutting into a person's brain while the person was conscious, and that person did not feel anything. And we also know today that if you avoid touching blood vessels and just cut or touch neurons somewhere, you would not feel anything, because there simply are no receptors there. Nature did not design it that way. And therefore, this cognitive fatigue does not manifest as pain. Only some people feel a kind of tension. As you said it is more like brain fog. Everything becomes unclear. There's also a simple irritability and nervousness, but I don't associate it with work or workload. I rather try to explain it in other ways. There's still so much to do. Yeah, that's how it is. Indeed, this is also related to why overwork is connected to burnout syndrome, which is very relevant today. As they say, we do not necessarily feel our own burnout. If we see a fire burning, everything is obvious. Smoke, flames, fire. But when I burn out and am overworked, I simply do not feel it until sleep starts to change. In relationships, I become more unpleasant. I don't want to go to work, and so on. Yeah. In fact, when it comes to our collective fatigue, the only thing we can really rely on are emotions. But then the question is whether we are able to recognize them well enough to connect cause and effect. And then what do? Are we able to stop? To say stop? It is 5 o'clock. I need to go home. And on Saturday and Sunday, I will not take work home and will properly rest. I will go recharge my battery, walk in nature, spend time with friends. This is really also a matter of mental hygiene. It may not be so obvious. In developed countries, it is relatively well managed, and organizations are increasingly taking care of employee well-being. But it is still more the exception than the rule, and it is of enormous importance.
I think people listening will be intrigued by these things. They'll wonder how they could learn more from you or where to follow you. People oftentimes ask, where could I learn more about this? So if there's anything you would like to promote or talk about where people could follow this kind of thinking, additional reading resources.
Es domāju, ka jau pieminētās.
I think the already mentioned Lisa Feldman Barrett's book, How Emotions Are Made, is very good. It is written in simple language. It is a work about emotions, about free energy, and about how the brain predicts. There are really very interesting examples, and I personally have learned a lot from her. Carl Friston, I probably would not recommend unless you have problems with sleep, because reading his text you can fall asleep very well. He really writes in a very nice, intelligent, but complicated way. But it is of interest. Carl Friston has quite a lot on the predictive mind. I think one of the books is called The Predictive Mind. And then there is Anil Seth, a very interesting American neuroscientist who writes and speaks a lot about this topic. He has excellent video lectures. I think you can find a TED Talk called Your Brain Hallucinates Your Conscious Reality. I can also find the specific references and send them to Baiba if that will be helpful in any way.
Konkrētās atsauces un aizsūtīt Baiba.
This was greatly illuminating. I've learned and unlearned things in just this brief hour, so greatly appreciative of your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edmunds, for this conversation. It was our pleasure to learn and unlearn some things about how mind works and how people are storing and building memories, and also how emotions work. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation to be part of our podcast. And we will say, have a great evening and see you maybe for follow-up conversation. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.